Hello, everybody. We are now about to venture into that long misunderstood, much maligned, but eternal document, the Constitution. Welcome to week two of second quarter of our American Constitution. Okay, so now we're going to get into this week. You're actually going to read the first three articles of the Constitution. Okay, these are the articles that lay out the legislature, the executive branch, and the court systems. Now, there's a lot to kind of get through here, and some of what they're saying here, right, may be a little challenging to understand, right? Because as modern Americans, there's a few phrases and clauses that they use that are a little challenging for us to understand because they were very brief, right? If you look at the entire Constitution, it's, in modern parlance, it's maybe 15, 20 pages. That's it, right? Typical congressional spending bill is about 1,000 pages, just saying. Okay, so one of the things that I think is challenging for us is the founders were very short, direct, to the point, because all of them understood what they were saying, right? Most of them had served in government and the military together. They had known and corresponded with each other's from before the revolution. So we're talking at least 15 to 20 years. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. They knew exactly how they wanted to do it, give or take. But they didn't have to put a whole lot of, there's no fine print in the Constitution. No fine print. It was all up front right there. So as you go through the first three articles, okay, there's a couple of things that I want you to pay attention to. First of all, let's go to the preamble, right? Hopefully everybody's heard this at one time or the other, right? We the people, this is an important phrase, we the people of the United States, not the legislatures, not the states, the people of the United States are to form a more perfect union. This was very important. It was very important that all 13 states be united together. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. George Washington, got that bad boy right up front. Promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. To ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America, right? Okay, probably heard that before, hopefully. All right, so here's a couple of interesting notes that you'll see in your study guide, okay? But I want you to read through these sections. So originally, senators were chosen by the states. They were not directly elected. We'll talk about this kind of as we go through the rest of the course. But that was, again, one of those compromises to give the states a greater share of power over how the federal government run. Originally, the state legislatures chose the two senators. This was not changed until the early part of the 20th century under Woodrow Wilson. I don't have enough time to talk about him in this course. That's probably another course, but okay. And then there's a couple of other things. If you look at section 3, where it talks about impeachment, very important these days, how impeachment works. Section 4 is kind of interesting because we're having a lot of debate these days, right? Why is the Constitution so relevant? Why are we discussing it? Because right now we're discussing the role of the federal government in running, regulating, changing, whatever, elections. Because Congress in Article 4 seems to give most of that power to the states, but there's a little squishy part in there, okay? Section 8 is the real section that I want to get into, because Section 8, as I list here in your study guide, is where the specific things are given to Congress, right? Congress shall. Now, the word shall in any government parlance is a very specific word. Means that's the way it is. These are the things that are reserved only to Congress, okay? Things like borrowing money on the credit of the states, regulate commerce, coin money, establish post offices, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to support and maintain a navy, okay? But there's a couple of hidden clauses here that I want you to read, and it's kind of tricky, as we're going to find out when we get into some Supreme Court cases. They put a couple of clauses here that I think have kind of gotten away from probably what they originally intended. Here's a couple of them. Number one is at the very end. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all the other powers vested by this Constitution, the government of the United States or on any department or officer thereof. This is called the necessary and proper clause. And as we're going to see as we get into some Supreme Court cases, this clause right here, Article 1, Section 8, is pretty much the basis of everything Congress does. Everything. To regulate commerce, to, let's just go to some practical examples. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, anything, any big spending social program that Congress wants to do, this is the basis of all of their decisions, the necessary and proper clause. And we're going to see that this was argued over in several landmark Supreme Court cases. The other one was, which I found interesting, is the paragraph above it, where it says to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not to exceed 10 miles square, as may be by secession of particular states, become the seat of government of the United States. Here is where the argument comes over the District of Columbia. Oh, those poor people, they should be a state. Very clearly says in the Constitution, the District of Columbia was carved out to be the seat of government. It was not meant to be part of a state. It was to be totally separate. This was to ensure that if there were ever senators or congressmen, they would not be unduly influenced by the fact that the seat of government was where they lived, right? This is the argument, you know, that thing they put on their license plate in DC, no taxation without representation. Okay. Now, because you live in the District of Columbia, you live in the seat of government, which is set aside specifically not to have legislation or legislators, because it is meant to be the seat of government. Now, there's some strange things they've been trying to do. It's like, oh, let's just shrink it all down to just the area around the mall and the Capitol Hill, and then the rest of it will make, no, it's not how that works. It's right here in the Constitution. So all of this continual kerfuffle about trying to make the District of Columbia a state, not in the Constitution. Okay, next. Section 9 is all about money, of course, right? That's also the writ of habeas corpus, tax or duty. Interestingly enough, funny thing here, there are no titles of nobility in the United States. There's no Duke of, or again, this was very specific, right? They did not like the landed nobility and gentry from England. So they very specifically put here that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. Pretty clear. Okay. Now, Section 10, again, very specifically limits the power of the states to do certain things. And again, this was very important, right? No state shall enter into any treaty alliance, coin money, or grant any title of nobility. No state will put in their own imports or duties, right? The states were putting on duties, basically taxing the goods moving from another state. It was stifling commerce. Congress said, that right, job, responsibility is for us alone, not the states. Very important. Okay, so let's move on to Section 2. Section 2, of course, is the commander-in-chief, and you can really see, I think, the hand of George Washington here. Now, let's talk about a couple of things here briefly, and you can read in here and see what you see. The Electoral College, right? This always gets a lot of hate every 4 years because, like, well, it's the popular vote. The candidate that wins the popular vote should be elected president, not the candidate that gets the most votes in the Electoral College. No, that was again by design for a very specific reason. Okay, the founders were constantly trying to balance the interests of the bigger, more populous states and the smaller, less populated states. And the Electoral College was one of the ways that they did that. The net effect of the Electoral College is that you have to have a constituency spread throughout the country. If you think about it, and this is my opinion, but I think the math sort of supports me, if we had a truly popular election, the presidential candidates would go to New York, Los Angeles. They would go up and down 95 and up and down the West Coast. That's it. They might go to Texas a little bit now because, of course, Texas is populating as California is depopulating, but that's another topic of conversation. But they would basically go up and down the coast, and the famous, what is sometimes termed flyover country, wouldn't care. Don't care because we don't need their votes. If you get the majority of the votes in, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, Philadelphia, Boston, Miami, you're done. That's all you need. Again, they were trying to very specifically force presidential candidates to be national candidates, not regional, not coastal, national candidates. And I think the Electoral College, for the most part, has held up pretty well. Now, the lopsided factor of that is, right, let's do the math again. If a president gets a lot of votes in California or New York, they're going to win the popular vote. I think if you've picked into the analysis of the 2016 and 2020 elections, that's where Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden got a whole bunch of votes. California, New York. Why? Well, they're the most populous states. But they only have so many electoral votes based on their congressmen and senators. Again, that's by design. Okay, next. And then, of course, the role of the commander-in-chief is very clearly set out in Section 2, right? Again, I think you can kind of see the hand of George Washington here. He wanted to make sure that the new country could defend itself in times of war without having to deal with all of the nonsense and constant begging and backbiting and politicking that he had to do with the Continental Congress to win the war. Okay. Section 3 is actually pretty interesting because Section 3 is talking about the Supreme Court, or the courts, the judicial part of the Constitution. And it's the shortest, and it's very vague. It basically lays out a Supreme Court, and then it says, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. That's it. Doesn't say we have district courts, circuit courts. This all came out later as the practical effect of the Constitution said, yeah, we don't need these Supreme Court guys running around the country trying cases. We need to have kind of a hierarchy and a pecking order here, right? But the other thing that's important here, we're going to talk about this in the third quarter when we get into talking about Supreme Court cases, is the Constitution is very clear on what kind of cases the Supreme Court would have original versus appellate jurisdiction on. I'm not going to go into that right now because that's the third quarter, but this is very important because, again, there are certain types of court cases, legal challenges that only the Supreme Court can handle. And then the rest of it, they basically end up being an appellate court for federal and, as they work their way through federal, district, and circuit courts. And this is very important too, right? When we look at some of these Supreme Court cases, nearly all of them are appellate. There's not a lot where the court has original jurisdiction. There are a few, but for the most part, as we see the evolution of the role of the federal court system, certainly for the Supreme Court, it's mostly handling appellate cases. Okay, so this, of course, is your opportunity to weigh in the assignment this week of whether you think that Article 1, 2, and 3 have sort of stood the test of time. But I think for the most part they have. Now let's talk about one other hot button that is a continual point of contention, and this is the 3/5 clause, right? This is the clause that said that slaves only counted for 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation. Okay, very hot button topic. I'm just going to weigh in with the practicalities. Here's the practicality. The 3/5 clause was called a compromise, right? And as anybody knows, a compromise is typically something that makes everybody mad and unhappy because nobody gets what they want. But a compromise is necessary in life, in all relationships, for anybody who's been married knows, because you have to have some sort of agreement that everyone can live with without walking away. They may not like it all. They may not think it's fair or right or just, but they can live with it because the alternative is they walk away and have no deal, right? And this is not the old TV show Deal or No Deal. This was not an option for the founders. They had to get this Constitution done. Therefore, they made a compromise with the 3/5 clause. It would, turn out to be a festering boil that would, later cause a civil war. But in 1787, it was vital for them to keep all of the states together to produce a document that could be ratified by all the states and then be put into action. However, did some analysis today, did some digging, went to one of my favorite websites, All Things Liberty. They publish a yearly book, anthology of articles about the American Revolution and colonial period. What they did was look at the actual numerical effects of the 3/5 clause on representation. And there's a whole table here if you want to look at it. Here's the article that I looked at. Fascinating. Here's the practical effect. And a gentleman named Glenn Beck did all this math about 10 years ago, and his math holds up to a certain extent. The effect of having only 3/5 of the slave population of the South served to dilute their representation in Congress, right? Interesting point that this article made is because free women and children were counted for the census, but slaves were only counted as 3/5. The practical effect was having basically all free people counted in the census, again, watered down the effect, the number of representatives that the slave states would have. Now, some people would say, well, yes, but the slave states still dominated American politics. True. Again, that's because of the Senate and how the Senate was equal representation for all the states. That's why you're going to see many of the great compromises dealing with slavery up to the Compromise of 1850 was to keep that balance in the Senate between free states and slave states. But in the House of Representatives, as you can see here, if you want to look at this table that's in this article, the effect was it gave more representation to the northern states that would become free states and would see their population grow much more rapidly than the southern states, where you would see a large percentage of their population up until the Civil War being composed of slave labor. So if you think that the South had a lot of political power in sort of what we would come to call the antebellum era, you may be right. Think how much more power they would have had if they had counted all of those slaves for representation. Now, the flip side to that is you say, well, they shouldn't have counted any of them at all. True. However, that was the compromise. Again, compromises are messy. They are not clean. They are not moral. They are not even, they don't necessarily always stand the time. But at the time, they are necessary because the southern states, particularly the eternally troublesome state of South Carolina, basically said, if you don't do this, we're walking out. And that was not going to happen. So, again, you can argue the merits of this. Obviously, it's something you can investigate and think about and ponder for yourself. But if we did not have a constitution, where would we be today? Or if we had had a couple of the states split off and go their own way, how would we be today? This was a genuine concern at the time. So we've come to the first three articles. Take your time, read them slowly. Probably have to read them a couple of times because some of them are written in jargon that we don't really get these days. Keeping in mind, of course, that they knew exactly what they were writing. Okay, so we will finish up with the rest of the Constitution next week.